Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news, expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
It wasn't good enough to be just a peak athlete. You also had to be of sound mind, have that certain poise. You needed to be a well-rounded human being. And that's how they translated it visually into these sculptures.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. So it is midsummer, and this year there are a lot of exciting things going on in Paris, in particular, where the Paris Olympics are in full action with tons of events around the city, including, I believe, even swimming in the Seine. And while this might not seem like a particular art story, art and the Olympics have a long history, a lot of crossover in the ancient and modern Olympics, which we will speak about in a second. And so this month, we thought that we would have our popular Three Things column, which is an article that looks at three fascinating aspects of a work of art that is well-known and well-loved. Often we look at very surprising backstories to these pieces. We thought we would have our three things focus on one of the most famous pieces of art that is about the Olympics, the Discobolus, which depicts an ancient Greek athlete throwing the discus, which is one of the oldest events in the Olympics. Our galleries editor, who is based in New York, Annika Olsen, wrote a very compelling article on this, and she is joining me today to talk about the discus thrower, which has an amazing history, a complex history that takes us to the before Christ era and right up until modern times. So thanks for being on the Art Angle with us, Annika.
Hi, Kate. Really excited to be here.
Great. Neither of us are in Paris, sadly, but we will kind of bring ourselves there today. There's actually a lot of art going on in Paris this month as well, because the Olympics, as we will talk about briefly, art used to be an Olympic sport. We have an article about that too on the website. There was painting and sculpture. There isn't anymore, but there are lots of painting and sculpture events around the city. There's a show at Gagosian looking at the art of the Olympics. There's a show at the Monet de Paris looking at the history of the Olympic medal. And there's also a show at the Louvre, which looks at the history of the entire event, which maybe that's a good place to start, Annika, because there are these two eras of the Olympics, which I actually didn't even know, and you told me about. And the show at the Louvre is actually an exploration of the dichotomous history. So the Discobolus, as we'll talk about today, is this ancient Greek sculpture that has transcended both of these events. Can you explain a bit about these two eras? And maybe that's a good place to get into the discus thrower itself.
Yeah, there is this really interesting discrepancy about how people perceive the ancient and modern Olympics, where I think some people think it's been this continuous event since time immemorial, whereas actually the ancient Olympics fizzled out well over a millennia ago, the late 300s CE, Common Era. And then it wasn't until the late 19th century that they were sort of reintroduced. And it was a really interesting story because it was this French aristocrat, His Excellency Pierre de Coubertin. He was a historian and an educator, and he was familiar with the ancient Olympics, and he saw a lot of value in competition, and more specifically in international competition, these sort of cross-cultural agreements and communication. His sort of motto for the modern Olympics, as well as for himself, was the important thing in life is not the triumph, but the struggle. The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to fight well. So he established the International Olympic Committee in 1884, and the first modern Olympic Games were the Summer Games in Athens in 1886. For comparison, the last ancient Olympics that was officially recorded was in 393. There's evidence that it continued on for a few episodes after that, but it essentially started fizzling out after that.
And that was because of the Roman Empire taking over. What was the reason that it fizzled out?
Right, exactly. So it was in a period after Constantine, the obviously very famous emperor, made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire. A later emperor, Theodosius I, in 380, made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, which was a great elevation for the religion. But in 392, he fully outlawed pagan worship. And it was the following year that the last official recorded Olympic Games were made. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize when you're comparing the ancient to modern Olympics, is the ancient Olympics were very religious for the Greeks. They were an interwoven part of their culture, their identity, and it was their way to worship Zeus. And in Olympia, they had different shrines to different gods. So it was an integral part of their religious practice.
Well, luckily, there's quite a lot of art that has remained from this original ancient Olympic era. And one of them is the discus thrower, of which there are a few variants, which we will talk about. But maybe you can just start by explaining what this beautiful piece looks like.
Yeah, so the discus thrower is really prototypical of classical Greek sculpture. It shows a nude athlete, and the nude athlete is a discus thrower, and it shows him at the moment of peak tension when he has wound up, if you will, the discus and is not yet, and the next moment will be him releasing it. This was quite a departure from previous Greek sculpture, and this style, classical Greek sculpture, has gone on to inspire centuries worth of aesthetics in the Western world.
There's other works, there's famous pottery that depicts some of the races. But this is, as you say, the position of the figure makes it especially iconic and famous. And the art critic Kenneth Clark described this, saying, Myron, who made the piece, created this enduring pattern of athletic energy. He's taken this moment of action that's so transitory that students of athletics still debate whether it's physically feasible. Can you speak a bit about this physical plausibility of this piece and what makes it so physically unusual?
Yeah, especially too when I was in school as a young art history student, one of the things that they first pointed out is that this wasn't an efficient way to be standing at any point in the discus throw. And so I think the common scholarship at that time, at least, was that Myron had taken some artistic liberties. He was really focusing on the composition, highlighting the athlete's body, and creating an overall aesthetically pleasing piece. More recently, I came across some coaches of modern discus throw who think that actually it might not be as implausible as originally thought. We have to take into account in the modern Olympics, the discus is much smaller. It's usually plastic with a metallic rim, little more than hand size. And these discus, as you can see, it's the size of a large dinner plate. This would have been made of bronze, lead, stone even. So there's some modern considerations, if it was that heavy, maybe this is how they would have found a more efficient way of playing the sport, or alternatively, they could have just had separate rules. Today, we know when you watch the Olympics, or if you tune into the discus throw this year, they rotate. There's these full rotations, and we don't know if perhaps back then you were required to stand without rotation. So it's a little nebulous.
Nevertheless, it is a very beautiful position. It's this sort of triangular shape that the figure is in, with its legs sort of standing straight and its arm extended behind, and its head, which we'll get to, in an interesting position. It's made of different kinds of material, but one as the original, and there are variations of it all over the world. What are the important sculptures of the discus thrower, and why are these ones special?
So the first discus that was discovered in the 18th century, more specifically in 1781, a villa that was on the Esquiline Hill in Rome, which is one of the 7 hills of Rome. And it was owned by a family called the Massimo family. One of the cadet branches of that family was the Massimo Lancelotti family, which is how this first version that was found got its name. And it's referred to as the Discobolus Lancelotti. And it was a marble piece that they dated to around the 2nd century CE. And what makes this interesting is it was a copy, and they knew it was a copy from various ancient writings, more specifically from Pliny the Elder, the famous ancient writer, author, naturalist. And they identified it as a copy of an ancient Greek version from the 400s by an artist named Myron. He was working between roughly 480 and 440 in Athens, which is where he was predominantly. And he worked almost exclusively in bronze, so they knew that this was likely a copy from a bronze piece that has ultimately been lost. It's likely that at some point that bronze original was melted down and used for something else. And the Romans typically made copies in marble simply because it was cheaper than bronze. As we know, Italy is full of these beautiful marble quarries, some of the most prized marble in the world, but especially in the early Roman Empire, they were having to import bronze, or a lot of it, so it was more expensive. It's interesting to note that when they did find this first version of it, even at that time, it was a sensation. Everybody wanted to see it. It was so cool. It had a lot of excitement around it. The Massimo family guarded it pretty closely, which, I mean, I would too, probably, if I had this priceless artifact.
Certainly.
What's interesting to know is that in this one, as I understand, it was found essentially almost intact. They did do some restoration, but one of the key things about it is you see the discus player looking back towards the disc.
So that's the first famous one. And that one, I believe, is in a museum in Rome, right?
Yeah. So it's part of the National Museums of Rome, and it's currently in the Palazzo Massimo.
We'll come back to that one because there's more to that backstory. But the second famous one, which is at the British Museum, is slightly different, was found in a different place.
Yeah. So pretty quickly after that one, in 1790, another copy of the Discobolus was found just outside of Rome in Hadrian's Villa, in a town of Tivoli. And this piece was purchased by a man named Thomas Jenkins. He was an art dealer, an antiquarian, and quickly after they found it, it was whisked off to a restorer's atelier, a restorer by the name of Carlo Albacini, before he then turned around and offered it for sale. And a man by the name of Charles Townley, he was a British country gentleman, and he was actually quite famous for his collections. He had a lot of great stuff, and so he wanted to purchase this. There was only one real problem with this second one, is that it didn't have a head.
Small hitch.
Small hitch. But this man, Jenkins, told him it's no problem at all because luckily enough, and lucky for you as a collector, we found the head right next to it. It was right there. Easy peasy. We'll pop it back on. It's just as good as the Massimo family one. So Townley went ahead with the purchase, and the piece was shipped to England. And when Townley saw it, he was still a little bit perturbed because in the version he purchased, the head was facing the other direction. It was facing down and forward, whereas the Massimo version was looking back at the discus. And this is also sort of illustrates the comparative lack of rigor, you would say, with provenance compared to today. He reached back out to Jenkins, obviously concerned that it looks totally different. And Jenkins consulted a papal antiquarian, and this papal antiquarian said, this is a much more beautiful version. This is clearly the way it's supposed to be. They improved upon Myron's composition. Yours is way better. We know today that the head attached to the Townley piece is likely not from a Discobolus. It could have been another classical Greek piece. So it was a little bit of, what would we say, used car salesman sort of tactics.
Buyer beware.
Buyer beware. But it has come to be appreciated for its own sort of je ne sais quoi. And there is also, I think, also confusion, people thinking it looked one way and then they'll see another version and it's looked the other way. Because I would say both copies have been recopied again up through modern times, sort of flip-flopping between the orientations of the head.
Yeah, the British Museum describes it as an alien head. And while the pictures were loading up on, on the website, I was wondering what they meant by that. But this is what they meant. As you said, there's these two famous pieces. Actually, there's one on view at the Louvre, which is a third discus thrower, which we won't talk about today, but there is one on view in the Louvre, which is a lesser famous one. And I think that one is facing the direction of the Lancelotti piece, perhaps. So what do we know about other works that Myron would have created? And how does this Greek statue in particular compare to other famous statues like the Artemisian bronze, for example?
So Myron is interesting because while we had so many artists and artisans working contemporaneously to him, he seems to have been a bit of a star in the ancient Athenian world. And He was one of the first artists to really harness this ability to create sculptures that conveyed that sense of movement and tension while still maintaining aesthetic proportions. We don't actually have any of his original works still left. All of them have been lost, but we do know about them from writers such as Pliny and other writers of that time. One of his most famous lost pieces was a giant heifer that was in the center of Athens, so a giant cow. But we also know that there was another athlete that had similar fame to the Discobolus, which was a runner, and it was called the lattice. Apologies for the pronunciation if I butchered that, which we think had similar tension as to the Discobolus, a runner about to take that first large leap. But again, this has been lost to history, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that it had been said at the time or in reflections after that if a calf would think that the heifer was her mother because it was just so realistically sculpted, just to emphasize the talent of this artist, which certainly contributed to his fame at the time. There is another famous work that connects to the Olympics that is from ancient Greece. It's the boxer at rest, which you speak about in your column. It doesn't look at all like the discus thrower. It's very, very different, even though it's also a depiction of an athlete. Maybe that's a great way to talk about these different periods of art, which you mentioned at the top of the episode.
Yeah, so what's interesting to note specifically with Myron is he's exemplary of the classical period. And when talking about ancient Greek sculpture casually, it sort of gets all muddled together. But we were moving out of the archaic period in Greek sculpture, which made Myron's look that much more spectacular. Because in the archaic period, you had these more vertical, linear, architecture-inspired sculptures. You can always recognize them both because you can see the influence of ancient Egyptian art. They're usually upright and much more typological. And they also have these little, what I would call cutesy yet haunting smiles. They're referred to as the archaic grin, I believe. And then you move into the classical period, which is where Myron's working. And you see these aesthetics of poise. For instance, although he's at the peak point of tension and throwing the discus, his face is really unbothered. He is not worried, no stress. And you see that again in pieces like the bronze that you just mentioned, which was of either Poseidon or Zeus, we're not entirely sure. But again, probably drawn off of the positioning of a javelin thrower. And again, the face is very serene. Even though he's pulling back to throw, it would have been a lightning bolt or a trident. You wouldn't see that. And that speaks to this sort of classical period mind-body preoccupation. It wasn't good enough to be just a peak athlete. You also had to be of sound mind, have that certain poise. You needed to be a well-rounded human being. And that's how they translated it visually into these sculptures. You have these sort of dichotomies between like physical movement and labor with this sense of serenity in the overall piece.
Right.
And then oftentimes, and I think probably where the most popular ancient Greek sculptures come from is the Hellenistic period, which followed it. And that's where you get pieces like the Winged Victory, my favorite piece, Laocoon and his sons, which is the three figures being eaten by sea serpents or attacked, and you get the Boxer at Rest. Now, the Boxer at Rest, comparing it to the Discobolus, is really interesting because the subtle shifts from idealization towards realism are really apparent, as you say, whereas the Discobolus is an example of physical perfection. Like there is no blemish, his brow is unfurrowed. The Boxer at Rest, he really shows that he's been beat up. He's got cauliflower ears, as is typical even with boxers today. He's got little cuts on his face. His toes are a little bit mangled and off-center.
Even just the fact that he's sitting at rest feels like we've entered a more modern idea to show an athlete not on duty. It's like there's something very different even in the conception of that.
Yeah, especially too, we don't know if he was a winner per se. Whereas I think before, especially with Myron, it was maybe assumed that these were victors of some kind.
Right. And so that idealized figure and this idea of the victorious figure, the winner, the perfect body, helps to phase us into where this all gets a little bit darker. In the early 20th century, classical art including the discus thrower, were appropriated in Europe by fascism and also by the Nazis. Can you explain what happened there and how the discus thrower gets into the fray of Nazi Germany?
So in the 1930s, in Italy, as we know, Mussolini was in charge, and the Lancelotti family had still managed to have the Discobolus. At that point in time, they were running into money problems. Obviously, they had this very valuable sculpture, and they initially attempted to sell it to the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, which just would have been incredible in hindsight as New Yorkers. But the Metropolitan Museum said it was far too expensive. I believe they were asking around 7 million lira. So they took it to, unfortunately, the next interested buyer, which was none other than Adolf Hitler. So Hitler had a fascination with classical Greek aesthetics. We know now, obviously, it was through this obsession with the perfect human, the unmarred human, and he saw reflected in these sculptures one of his goals. So they did end up ultimately selling it to him, and he installed it at the Glyptothek, a museum known for its classical and ancient art and artifacts.
In Munich, yeah.
In Munich, exactly. And then later, in a 1938 film that documented the 1936 Olympics, produced by Germany, they very famously used the Discobolus in the opening sequence.
Right.
In hindsight, this is very alarming and scary because what you see, at first thought is, especially about an athletic film, is you see the Discobolus rotating, and as it rotates, it slowly turns into a man, a white German man, who becomes this sort of Discobolus discus player personified. And this is very ominous in hindsight because this is truly what Hitler was looking for, to create a perfect race, an Aryan race.
So it became like a key piece of propaganda, basically, through an appropriation. And this was Leni Riefenstahl's film Olympia, which is one of the most notorious propaganda films. You're right, it is extremely ominous. I mean, the camera starts panning through ancient Greek villas in Athens.
I also just think from a broader lens, it's important to remember that the appropriation of classical Greek aesthetics was not unique to Hitler or Nazi Germany. I think that's probably the worst case of it. Mm-hmm. But we see that through architecture as well. For instance, the White House in the United States was a prime example of neoclassical architecture, and they did that because they wanted to tap into the idea of the ancient democracy, bringing alive the idea of democracy. Napoleon similarly used a lot of the aesthetics of ancient Greece to legitimize his regime, to give it a sense of long and storied history.
Yeah, it's interesting how much those aesthetics have pervaded throughout time and have been taken up. They just slip through context and have been taken up in so many different ways, positive and obviously extremely negative. In the case of German history in particular, and this discus piece. So after the war, what happened to the discus thrower that was at this megalomaniacal institution that Hitler had made full of Greek art?
After the war in 1948, and in large part due to the U.S.'s help and people like the Monuments Men, it was returned to Italy. Interestingly, in recent news, which we have covered here at ArtNet News, the National Museum of Rome requested from the Munich Museum to have the base returned, because I guess they had kept the base and not the actual Discobolus. So they requested the return of the base, to which the Munich Museum responded, actually, you should give us back the sculpture because we purchased it fair and square. Regardless, between Mussolini and Hitler, both sides, I would say, are horrible. There was a little bit of a spat there, and both, as far as I know, the Roman Museum still has Discobolus, the Munich Museum still has the base.
Yeah, I think it was also, as the Italian government has shifted to the right, I think there was also a whipped up controversy that this all happened, I think it was last December, right? And so when this emails back and forth emerged about this 18th century marble base that you were just speaking about, suddenly there was this kind of article that came out in Italian media, that a restitution claim, which is quite a term given who would be making a restitution claim. But then it turned out that the State Museum said no, we're not requesting it. And so it was kind of this much ado about nothing story, but nevertheless brought this piece to the fore again as this very idealized sculpture of Various forms of nationalism in Italy is also, its museums are becoming much more nationalistic in the wake of the Meloni government. So it dovetails quite interestingly with modern politics yet again.
Yeah, and I think there is some conjecture to be made about the Italian administrators making some really great claims, like, over my dead body, will you get this statue back? I think it really speaks to their political milieu. I'm not sure how serious either of these requests initially were.
Yeah, but they took it as a moment to really make some superlative
noise.
statements, which made headlines, including at ArtNet. So the sculpture remains in Rome, and the other one is at the British Museum. As a last question, how is this sculpture still existing in the visual culture of today? Like, is it inspiring contemporary art at all? Where do we find depictions of it?
Well, I will say, just also speaking to the moment of the Olympics happening right now, the Discobolus specifically shows up in Olympic imagery, everything from posters to commemorative stamps. In the very first modern Olympics in 1896, it was part of the commemorative stamp. It's on guidebooks and merch. In Asia, they started putting it on their currency. It's shown up on euros. So it's really been used and tapped as this sort of pervasive symbol of the modern Olympics. I think there's probably a conversation to say that it's being appropriated similarly, because as we discussed, the modern and ancient are a bit different. But it is really interesting seeing that it's still thousands of years later carrying that much weight of international renown.
It's such an iconic position. I could even imagine seeing it becoming like a TikTok trend around the Olympics or something.
Maybe we should start that TikTok trend.
We should maybe start that, yeah. I have to get TikTok first, but that'll be the next thing I do. This has been fascinating. I learned a lot today, and luckily there are, as we said, several iterations and copies and depictions of this piece all over the world, including on the exterior of the Greek Center in Australia, I believe. So lots of opportunities for this piece of art to just live on through many different contexts. And it's been a pleasure to learn about it today with you, Annika. So thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have time, take a moment to rate and review us. It'll help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Carolyn Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.